Good evening. My name is Zach Baranovich, and I am the Graduate Research Assistant for the Bwazzi Center for Religion and American Public Life. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's panel. Before we begin, we ask that you please turn off your cell phones. And additionally, we want to make you aware that our panel discussion this evening will be recorded and posted online to be viewed at our website, bc.edu/Bwazzi. Before we begin, we'd like to make you aware of a couple of our upcoming events that might be of particular interest. On the evening of Monday, February 24th, we will host a panel discussion entitled Race, Class, and Ethnicity in College Admissions, Deans Discuss the Harvard Case. Co-sponsored with the Theoboma Ahana and Intercultural Center here at BC, three of Boston College's deans will be joining us. Susan Gennaro, Dean of the Connell School of Nursing, Vincent Rougeau, Dean of the Law School, and Stanton Wortham, Dean of the Wynn School of Education and Human Development. They will engage in a discussion around the Harvard case, a lawsuit brought against the university requesting they end the use of certain identity categories, such as race, in their admissions considerations. The panelists will explore the lasting impact of this case and its possible long-term effects for institutions like Boston College. And on Wednesday, April the 1st, Tali Kritzman-Amir will present on her research at the luncheon colloquium entitled Swab on Your Way In, the Use of DNA Tests in Immigration, in which she will note that the increased use of DNA testing and immigration control signals a system that is aggressively exclusionary, increasingly privatized, reliant on biopower, and increasingly racialized. These are just two of a number of our events we'll be hosting this semester. Our evening events request RSVPs. Our luncheon colloquium require RSVPs. So to RSVP and to find out more information about these and all of our events, we direct you to the website.
There is a free lunch.
There is a free lunch, which is why RSVPs are required. This evening's panel will engage the question, is there a new anti-Semitism? The question arises quite necessarily from the recent rise in anti-Semitic speech and hate crimes targeting the Jewish communities in this country and elsewhere. We will begin with our panel's discussion of the meaning of this apparent trend, and then the panelists will take questions from the audience. Our Q&A, however, will take a slightly different format than past events. At both ends of each row are index cards and small pencils. As questions arise during the panel discussion, please write your questions on the index card, and as you write them, send them back down to the end of the aisles, and we'll come down to retrieve them. It's perfectly acceptable to pass the questions down during the panelist conversation. So for those of you sitting at the end of an aisle, when the question arrives, just set it down in the stair next to your seat, and one of the Bwazzi Center staff members will come by and collect them. As we near the end of the panelists' comments, we'll collect any remaining cards, and Father Massa, our moderator this evening, will then ask the questions of the panelists. It's our hope that this will streamline the process and allow for more questions. A special thank you must now be extended to BC Hillel and the Center for Christian Jewish Learning for co-sponsoring this evening's panel. The Center for Christian Jewish Learning is represented this evening by their director, James Bernauer, one of our panelists. And we're also grateful for BC Hillel's presence this evening. The purpose of Boston College Hillel is to help serve the social, cultural, and religious needs of Jewish students at BC and to enrich campus culture for all. The organization welcomes a variety of members of the Boston College community from all backgrounds to their events, which include Shabbat dinners, a Hanukkah celebration, Passover Seder services for the High Holy Days, and more. Andrew Ritter is the president of Boston College Hillel. He's a junior in the Morrissey College of Arts and Sciences studying poli-sci and history. In addition to fulfilling his duties as president of BC Hillel, where he's overseen a remarkable growth in membership during his time at BC, Andrew also works as an undergraduate researcher. He recently returned from a semester abroad at the University of Otago in New Zealand. Andrew has graciously accepted our invitation to introduce our panelists this evening, so please help me welcome the president of BC Hillel, Andrew Ritter.
Thank you for that, and a warm welcome to everybody tonight. It is my honor to introduce the panelists, and we'll begin with our first panelist, which is James Bernauer. James Bernauer is the Kraft Family Professor in Boston College Philosophy Department, as well as the director of the Center for Christian Jewish Learning. Father Bernauer's interests include Holocaust studies, German Jewry, and the philosophies of Michael Foucault and Hannah Arendt. His new book will appear in March 2020, Jesuit Kaddish, Jesuits, Jews, and Holocaust Remembrance, published by the University of Notre Dame Press. In addition to several publications, in 2018, he guest edited an issue of the Journal of Jesuit Studies, which was dedicated to the Jesuits who were honored at Israel's Yad Vashem as righteous of the nations for their heroic acts during the Holocaust. Our second panelist is Susannah Heschel. Susannah Heschel is the Eli Black Professor and the Chair of the Jewish Studies program at Dartmouth College. She's written several books, including Abraham Geiger, The Jewish Jesus, The Aryan Jesus, Christian Theologians, and the Bible in Nazi Germany. Additionally, she has edited a number of additional books, including Moral Grandeur and Spiritual Audacity, Essays of Abraham Joshua Heschel, Insider, Outsider, American Jews and Multiculturalism, and most recently, The Muslim Reception of European Orientalism. Professor Heschel is a Guggenheim Fellow and the recipient of 4 honorary doctorates. She has held research grants from the Carnegie Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and the National Humanities Center. Our third panelist this evening is Mark Silk. Mark Silk is the director of the Leonard Greenberg Center for the Study of Religion in Public Life and a professor of religion and public life at Trinity College in New York. Professor Silk has served as editor of the Boston Review, as well as a reporter, editorial writer, and columnist in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. He is the founding editor of Religion in the News, a magazine published by the Center of Study of Religion and Public Life. Some of Professor Silk's publications include Spiritual Politics, Religion in America Since World War II, and Unsecular Media, Making News of Religion in America. We're grateful to each of our panelists for participating this evening, and now I'll hand it over to this evening's moderator, the director of the Boise Center, Father Mark Massa.
Welcome to all of you, the third welcome. I'm lucky because I got to invite 3 of my friends. I always say God has blessed me and my friends, who are also very smart intellectuals. So what we're going to try to do is shape this event so that the first 30 to 40 minutes will be a conversation among the panelists, and then we'll open up the conversation to you, and I'll take as many of the cards as you were writing as I possibly can. So we're not going to go down the line. I always say, as my students know, they think I believe that a straight road is a happy road, but we're not going to go down the road. So we're just going to throw it open. I guess my first question, which has to do with the title for tonight's events, is, as you all 3 of you know, unfortunately, anti-Semitism is not a new thing. It's a very old thing in Western culture. So I guess my question to you is there a new anti-Semitism, or is it simply a resurgence of the old anti-Semitism? And if there is a new anti-Semitism, how or in what ways is it different than the older varieties? Ladies first.
So, what's new? First of all, what's new is the challenge to democracy. It's the loss of faith in liberal democracy around the world, and it's come as a big shock to many of us. We weren't expecting this, and that's horrifying. It seems historically, whenever there is a major social, cultural, political shift, anti-Semitism goes on the rise. We've seen this in Europe, it's been marked. That is, anti-Semitism doesn't necessarily respond or arise or get worse when there's an economic crisis or when there's a famine. Those are conventional answers and explanations that have actually been disproven in some very careful studies by some historians from Germany, Christian Hoffmann among others, describe that it's when, for example, when Jews are permitted to live in a certain neighborhood, all of a sudden the violence begins. Those social and cultural shifts are happening today as well. And so I see that as, in some sense, a continuation. The one point that's often made that's worth thinking about is that anti-Semitism as such is identified as the hatred of Jews that allows no escape, so to speak. In other words, the difference between saying, you shouldn't be a Jew, you should be baptized a Christian. At least then you won't lose your life. You can be baptized and stay alive, let's say. I'm speaking now a little sardonically. But what we're finding with anti-Semitism is saying you have no right to live at all. And the kind of language that we're hearing that's been magnified, as we all know, by the internet and by some very loud and irresponsible voices in our so-called leadership, that also comes with the threat, the constant threat, your life is in danger. And that actually is quite shocking. It's not a threat that says, stop saying this, stop doing this. It's, I'm going to kill you.
So would you say then, so if I'm reading you correctly, Susannah, then what you're saying is, and the new anti-Semitism is new in some points, but really it's part of a much older, and it's the virulence spread by the social media that makes it new. Am I reading you correctly?
Yes, the
Okay.
virulence and the lack of any escape, threat.
I feel like I'm sort of talking over my shoulder at this fabulous group over here. You know, I think the one-word answer is that it's not very new. That's not one word. There is a tradition of the anti-Semitic views historically from both right and left. Jews are communists, anti-capitalists. Jews are capitalists. And you know, so that you have new twists on some of that. For example, at Charlottesville, when the demonstrators on the right said the Jews will not replace us. And I think that was a somewhat puzzling thing until you understood what they were talking about. Not that the Jews were going to take their jobs themselves, but the idea that George Soros and company, in the line of sort of rich Jewish capitalists undermining the system, would bring in immigrants to replace, you know, white working class people. I mean, so I think there have been some new twists that way. Let me just say quickly that a dozen years ago I was here at BC with Father Massa. We did a tag team lecture on anti-Semitism. It was just after the election of Barack Obama. I looked and took a look at, see what we said. It seemed like quite a different time in America. And at that time, I said, and I think I would still say that, anti-Semitism was not a public thing to any considerable degree in American public life. I don't think we say that now. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, so again, you would agree basically with Susannah that it's not new, but there are elements of it.
Yeah, but you know, let's also point out, since you mentioned Charlottesville, there was an outcry and an outrage in the country. I mean, look where we are right now. We're at a Catholic university talking about anti-Semitism. When has that happened historically? That's new too. The response, the outrage, the disgust that we're appalled that Christians are in solidarity with Jews, that's new.
Jim?
Yes, it strikes, I agree with the viewpoints that you have. There's something old and something new. The novelty is, I mean, I think of two novelties. One is, it's post-Holocaust anti-Semitism, and the other one is post-founding of the State of Israel anti-Semitism. And they have effect. With respect to the post-Holocaust, you see some of the old arguments being brought forward, namely, the Jews have control of everything. There was a paranoia to some of these people, if you've seen them on the internet. One that occurs to me, that they're talking about the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is a document that makes the Jews central characters in controlling the world and where it's moving. And there's a video called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. They go around asking people, well, why do you believe in the Protocols of Zion? And one of the people they interview is a fellow in New York. I don't know how he got into New York with this attitude, but he says, well, you look, they asked, why do you believe this? And he said, well, look, the Jews control everything. Look at New York. Look at New York. They control everything in New York. And he said, well, what about the mayor? He said, yes, exactly, the mayor. Giuliani. So this is the paranoid anti-Semitism you can't really deal much with. But in terms of the post-Holocaust, you do hear this argument all the time, well, they're making too much out of this. And then you run across the economic anti-Semitism. Somebody like Finkelstein has a book called The Holocaust Industry, all right? And what he's claiming is that somehow the Holocaust is being used to increase wealth among Jews. And I heard Elie Wiesel at a reception say that he mentioned this himself. He said, well, you've heard the expression, there's no business like show business. And he had to excuse himself, saying that he gives a lot of his money to this charity, I forget the particular charity. But I felt, for Elie Wiesel to be in a position where he had to defend himself, all right, for making money on the Holocaust, so you run across this type of anti-Semitism. The other one, which is perhaps more fraught with danger, I think, that's new, is the post-Israeli situation. That, one of the fine things about receiving an invitation like this, you start thinking about your past. I grew up in New York City, and I'd be a little anxious about a certain decline in the Catholic community of regard for Jews and Judaism, whether they're really concerned about it. And when I was growing up, Jews were in a position of a higher moral level. And part of it was because of the Holocaust, I'm sure. But the other part was they were so involved with the civil rights movement that we saw Jews as leaders in civil rights. Now that has changed in many of the Catholic communities I deal with, that Jews are identified with Israel. And there isn't that sharp distinction made between Jews and Israelis. And I think that's really a great danger if it's not directly addressed. It is being addressed, of course, by the Jewish communities. But it is part of the reality that I run across with some of the...
Let me pick this up then. So it seems to me that part of there is a new version of the anti-Semitism. It's the vociferousness, it's the use of the internet, it's the willingness to say things publicly that 10 years ago were no longer acceptable. I was talking to some of my Jewish students, and it's astonishing. Jewish students at Boston College have been the object of Jewish jokes, done supposedly, scare quotes, jest, but nonetheless, the kind of thing that I think 10 years ago nobody would. We thought that those were like black jokes. Those are things that were no longer possible, and it was no longer politically correct to even say out loud. And now people can feel that it's said. It's okay, at least in some circumstances, to say out loud. What role, if any, have the debates over the state of Israel and the politics of the state of Israel had in all of this? You're the guy in the media, so you.
Oh, I think, the situation of Israel is huge. Certainly when it's talking particularly about the rest of the world, but also in this country, the rise of the rising criticism of Israel, and we can talk about to what degree that's deserved or not, or maybe we won't talk about it, but certainly
it's up to you.
The behavior of Israel, of Israel's government, the kinds of things that the dominant prime minister of the past 2 decades says, and really ever since the Six-Day War, the sense that this is a powerful, if little, country has had a very strong effect, and concern about Palestinian rights, concern about. There's a whole web of things that have contributed to attitudes which can be found in Democratic members of Congress and so on. So the degree to which Israel is an object of criticism, and the degree to which that's produces anxiety in the Jewish community, I think is very important, and it really raises a question which I think lurks in the background for Jews who don't tend to talk about theology, but do feel that somehow there's and I say this literally, God-given right to this piece of the earth, that God, somehow gave that territory to the Jews. That's us. That's intrinsic to the religion. And therefore, if you call into question Jewish rights to that land, you're criticizing Judaism. And that begins to move into the territory of anti-Semitism. I mean, so Israel actually is core at that, to that story.
Susannah or Jim?
Well, let me give you just one story. I meet every second or third year a group of Jesuits from around the world get together and they discuss, we're all involved in some way with Jewish issues, and then we discuss them ourselves. So about 10 years ago, we went to Israel, and we had a meeting there, and we met with this spokesperson for the settlers movement, who was a woman at the time. And it was a very good conversation. She was very appealing. But one of the Jesuits asked her, well, what about all these Palestinians here? How do you feel about them? And she said, and this is pretty much a quote, she said, they're a political problem, but not a moral problem. They're not a moral problem because they have no right to be here. They're a political problem because the rest of the world doesn't believe that. And then she said this, she said, you people come from Western countries and you're always asking these pragmatic issues. Look, we're here because this land was promised us. If we're wiped out here, that was God's will for us. And I thought, wow, can you imagine over a negotiating table with this sort of approach? But she's no longer the spokesperson of the settlers movement. But I'm haunted by that remark, that she could be that dismissive of what the dangers for the Jewish population of Israel were.
And the implication, Jim, would be that kind of attitude does contribute to anti-Semitism?
Well, I think it gets transferred into a sense that, again, I'll go back to the earlier formulation, which comes out of my childhood and growing up in New York City, and being very admiring of the Jewish community of New York City, that they're no longer elevated to a higher moral position as they had been by many of us. They're like other peoples, and they say crazy things like that woman, at least I would say that's a crazy thought. I'm finishing 12 years as director of the center, and I found the greatest difficulties I've had are not with anti-Semites. They don't come out of the woodwork that much, at least for me, but fundamentalists. And boy, you just face this wall. And it can be a theological anti-Semitism, but it's a wall, and it doesn't yield to rationality. And I can tell you anecdote after anecdote of people who run across like this. But
Susannah bent her head, which always makes me nervous. So Susannah, you want to?
I remember when I was growing up, and I also grew up in New York City, but I grew up in the Middle Ages. And when I was growing up, people used to say to me as a girl, when you grow up, you're going to get married, and your husband will put you on a pedestal, and you'll just be the queen, and that's how he'll treat you, a queen on a pedestal. That was the idea. Now, it sounds very lovely. Of course, it's nonsense. And anyway, not only would I never find such a man who would put that, but who would want to be up there anyway? There's not much to do up there, sitting on a pedestal. So being put on a pedestal was actually the problem, it seems, as the feminist movement began and so forth. We don't want to be on a pedestal as women, and I guess the Jews also don't want to be on a pedestal, as a moral pedestal, whatever it is. You want to be normal. Now, the question of Israel and Semitism, I'm from a certain generation, medieval generation, and I have to just say, Israel was, the formation of a state of Israel was actually a decision made by the United Nations, ratified by the majority of countries, voted for that establishment. And so it's problematic in one sense to say we're going to go against it. I mean, either we accept international decisions Or what do we want to be? What? We've come to a certain conclusion as human beings, as a human society of the world. Now, do I like the government? No, but show me a government I like. And who am I in this country with this unbelievable, excuse me, I will say what I think, a very corrupt person who is masquerading as a president in the White House. I feel like Jim Crow, Mr. Jim Crow is sitting there. What's going on here? And with my country like this, and most other countries also suffering, look what's going on in China. The vast majority of human beings are living under horrible governments, and I don't like the government in Israel either. Now, what this woman said to you, of course that's horrible, but you know what? I read about things like that coming from the mouths of our so-called leaders in this country also. It's shocking and it's horrifying. But I can't take, I don't say that this one or that one in the Senate or the House, some of these people who look like they're sometimes, a little something is, I don't know what they say and how they say it. What am I going to do? I need to clean up my own house, actually, and wasn't there a verse about that? Cast the stone, the one who was without sin. You know what I mean.
I've heard that.
It's not Shakespeare.
I never
It's
preach
not
on it.
Shakespeare.
I don't like what's going on in government policies just about anywhere, and yeah, I don't like the Israeli policies. I'm not happy about Palestinian leadership either, and I find it, but I don't think we're here to talk about a Middle East peace plan. We're here to talk about anti-Semitism and how Israel is actually, as they say now, weaponized to make anti-Semitic arguments both on the left and the right. And at a certain point, when it's coming from both ends, I think, wait a minute, what?
Marcus?
Yeah, I think it's worth introducing relatively early on in this discussion some quantitative data. The fact of the matter is, by the measures of anti-Semitic behavior and attitudes, they're low. They have not increased. The most recent statistics from the ADL, and by recent I mean last month, show that, I take a moment to understand what they mean by levels of anti-Semitism. I mean, there are 11 criteria. Some of them are sort of classic, and one would recognize those as anti-Semitic. Jews have too much control and influence on Wall Street. We can understand that. On the other hand, Jews have a lot of irritating faults. I mean, I think about every group would say that about itself. I'd like to know the proportion. I mean, sort of like, and only 10% actually say yes, which is not bad. But the point is, if you get 6 of these right, then you count in their sort of, over the years, this is standard. And at this point, it's only 11% of the American population that picks 6 of these, down from 15% 10 years ago when I was last year. So, I mean, those kinds of attitudes are down. If you look at the FBI statistics, and I looked at, I ran those over the last 10 years, and there wasn't a significant bump up in violent hate crimes against Jews in 2017, but it bumped down, and there's still relatively low numbers. Now, what those crime rates really tell us, can be questioned, but since they use the same criteria over time, it's worth noting that there hasn't been this decrease. What there has been an increase in is certain violent acts which haven't occurred. And a colleague of mine said, what you should tell them is that the most dangerous anti-Semitism are from people who know what a magazine release is. How many people here know what a magazine release is?
A magazine
Release.
A release.
That has to do with guns.
Oh, magazine.
And so if you're the kind of folks who have a lot of use of guns, which tend to be, that's where the violence is more likely to come from. And that's more or less what we've experienced in this country.
One of the studies that needs to be done is to correlate. So when someone says, for example, they don't believe the Holocaust happened, how many of those people also believe the United States never went to the moon? And that Lee Harvey Oswald did not kill President Kennedy and so forth. And that's what bothers me about many of these quantitative studies. They need to be correlated. Those with expressing hatred of Jews, what's next then for them? What should happen with Jews? Where do they take it to the next step? Do they also own a gun, in fact? And of course, what we're seeing now in the United States is a split between urban and rural. People living in urban centers, in a multicultural urban center, are perfectly happy to live with all kinds of different people from all over the world. People who live in rural areas, in monocultural societies, aren't. Why is it that people in the Dakotas are more interested in building a wall between the US and Mexico than people in Arizona and Texas? Does it make sense? So we need to pay attention to this, and I guess the question for us here would be, what do we here, as Christians, as Jews, perhaps we have Muslims here, people of other faiths, what do we do as religious people to try to change the mood? Because it's the mood that I believe is most important. It's not only what people say and what they believe, but the passion they bring to it. And that shouldn't be ignored. The role of passion in anti-Semitism.
It's very important.
So how can we address that as religious people to channel that passion into something very different?
Mark, let me press you a little bit. It's like our old graduate school seminar. We used to press each other. It feels, the statistic from the Anti-Defamation League may be that in fact, the actual amount of free-floating anti-Semitism has increased. It feels like that it's much more rampant, and that the violence is much more. And I think, I know from a number of friends, including Susannah, who go to neighboring synagogues, that synagogues now regularly lock their doors. Now, when the synagogue begins, a number of them have security guards in the front, and that is new. So the statistics may be down, but it feels more dangerous. Is that wrong?
No, I think that's right. And in fact, there's an interesting statistic to that very effect, which is, so these are recent statistics in which Americans as a whole are asked about whether discrimination against particular groups is increasing or decreasing. And virtually every group, it's about the same. I mean, there's some increase, a couple of points. Actually, there are two big changes. One of them, this is between 2016 and now. In 2016, the number of people who thought there was some discrimination against men was 0. It's now 39%. That tells you a lot.
I beginning to feel a little anxiety here.
I'm just saying. The next largest increase was against Jews, from 44% to 64%. People say that that there's at least some discrimination against Jews. I mean, I don't think there's been that kind of increase in discrimination against Jews, but I think it registers what you're talking about.
It feels.
I think, I just add a footnote here, because I do have a correlation, and it's a shared correlation. I'm teaching a course this semester on the Holocaust, and there's a collection of, so I sort of brought myself up to date on what recent scholarship is, and it's a collection that's actually stored over at Harvard, the Able collection, when in 1933, when Hitler came to power, this fellow American put out an advertisement asking the members of the Nazi Party, now these were the early members of the Nazi Party before it became advantageous to move up in the ranks, why they became Nazis. And one of the things that was so striking, and that sort of made that survey of the ADL, it minimized it for me, is that in anti-Semites, there are only 11 to 14% in that grouping of these early Nazis who were considered anti-Semitic. 33 had absolutely no indication of any prejudice toward Jews. Now, this is the early Nazi Party. These were true believers. So it's that passion that's the scary thing. It doesn't take a large percentage to do great damage to people.
But this is also self-reporting in that study by Theodor Adler. So they were self-reporting. The question is,
They were self-reporting.
part of the criticism of that study is that anti-Semitism was so widespread in Germany at that point that it seemed almost unnecessary to spell it out on the one hand. Others have said, well, it's sometimes difficult for someone to even recognize that they are anti-Semitic. I think we've all had that experience. Someone will say something, and then you say, what? What did you say? Oh, I'm not anti-Semitic. Well, what did you just say?
Yeah.
And you get this also. Men will say something sexist. Women will say something sexist. It's in the air.
Yeah.
I agree. The danger is with the right, the anti-Semitism comes with a gun. On the left, it comes with words. But words are also powerful. And that's of concern. But I think on both ends, there is rage and resentment. There's so much anger.
Let me ask you this. Do you think that, for the three of you, think that anti-Semitism is a subcategory of racism, or is it in a different category entirely from racism? Is it a racial issue? Is it an ethnic issue? Is it a culture? Is it a religious issue?
We had a recent program, which is, I think, there are programs around the country about, when did Jews become white? With sort of racializing that question. I don't think that, I understand what the point of that discussion is, but I would say that this is a much older, non-racialized prejudice that is, that comes out of a religious conviction. It comes out of, I was, listening to Bach's John Passion the other day. That's a pretty tough passion. There's some tough passion.
UC students here are accredited in theology. We can talk about supersessionism if you want, which is the belief that Israel was replaced. That Israel was replaced in God's eternal decrees with the Christian church. So, and that's the theological.
That's what you're taught here.
Yeah.
Well, no, we're not.
We had there. But your argument would be more anti-Semitism comes from theological beliefs like that than from any kind of racial.
Well, I'm less of a critic of supersessionism than some people, a lot of Jews. At least, we had it once upon a time. Compared to some other religions that are far out there, supersessionism is like, they're our cousins, they're gone, but it's okay. Once upon a time.
They owned the farm was sold.
I do think that it's what the evangelicals call replacement theology. And I do think both in the evangelical world, particularly with some sort of outliers like John Hagee, but also in sort of post-Vatican II Catholic thinking, the kind of strong replacement or supersessionist thought has lost ground. And even if people don't go fully with a dual covenant theology, the sense that the Jewish deal is not completely dead, to quote the Princess Bride, is one of my favorites. Is around and I think has strength.
Would you think it's a form of racism?
Do I think the racism and anti-Semitism issue? One of the things that's striking about anti-Semitism, first of all, is that Jews and anti-Semitism don't fit the categories. And in fact, you had a colleague here a long time ago, Mary Daly, who talked about methodology. If the categories don't work, then get rid of them. Yeah, but don't try to fit ideas into categories when it's not suitable.
Mary Daly would never have spoken in this room because it has pictures of men. And Mary Daly refused to speak to
It has men. It's not just pictures.
Well,
It has only.
Mary Daly was a very important thinker in my life and helped me a great deal to understand why I was so marginalized in my Jewish life. It keep me going as a woman against the sexism of religion. At any rate, the point is that Jews are Jews. A religion, a culture, an ethnic group, a race, what is it? Well, we don't quite fit. They're mixed up. Boundaries are fluid. And so in a very postmodern way, one might say. And the problem with anti-Semitism is that Jews are always said to have tremendous power. When there are groups that are targeted for hatred, they're usually viewed in a negative way as awful, as scum, as incompetent in some fashion. But with anti-Semitism, Jews who, as Mark said a moment ago, powerful, all-powerful, controlling everything. What Jim said about the protocols, the elders of Zion, the Jews run the world. That's different. So that's the problem. And perhaps, yeah, about supersessionism, I'd just say a word. The formal issue of supersessionism that was in fact addressed by Nostra Aetate that affirms this in post-Vatican II that Judaism has continued religious validity, that God does not take away a covenant that has been established. God doesn't say, uh-oh, I made a mistake. It doesn't happen. It doesn't make sense theologically. So of course, Judaism is recognized as having continued validity, but the real problem, I would say, is not even the supersessionism. Rather, the problem is the way Pharisees are described as despicable. The problem that arises, why didn't the Jews recognize Jesus as the Messiah? What's wrong with them? Well, they must be very unspiritual, very carnal. They don't have the heart, they don't have faith. So those kinds of negative qualities that are attributed to Jews as a result of these questions. One might also talk about conspiracy theory, which is so abundant these days. Why are people so attracted to conspiracies? I don't know why, although there's a new book I have to get by my colleague Russ Muirhead about conspiracy theory. I want to read that. I don't know, but...
Because conspiracy theories offer very easy answers to very difficult questions.
It offers easy answers, but just think about Judas. Think about the kiss of Judas. Think about what it means to turn Christ over by the Jews to the Roman authorities. It has that garden scene. There's a bit of there's something dark and dangerous going on, and I think it has given rise to a kind of spirit of conspiracy, and that concerns me. So it's not the formal theological issues, but it's rather these kinds of moods that are created.
So Jim, would you agree with these two that it's not a form of racism?
Well, I differentiate this way, and this is resting upon Longmore's work on medieval work.
Let's talk about it.
Okay, because he makes it, I am finding it more and more difficult to speak about anti-Semitism, because it's such an umbrella category that I prefer to speak about specific hostilities toward Jews and what animates them. Because there's a racial animosity, fictional, and then there's a religious animosity, which is greatly diminished. Anti-Israel. But what Longmore makes the distinction, he says the real distinction in the history of anti-Judaism, and I know I'm going to be corrected in a moment, but that's all right.
Susannah Heschel is going to overcome her native shyness.
But he makes the point that the real differentiation should be between these fantasies about the Jew and the theology. It's the fantasies that did the greatest damage. The bloodletting of Christian children at Passover time, one after the other. This is not church doctrine. And this is where you're right. You can change all the church doctrine in the world, but if people read Judas in a certain way, and they don't realize that Jesus was a Jew, which is eventually coming across more and more to people now because it's being communicated through the churches. But I was asked, I mentioned this to my class the other day, I used to preach down here at St. Ignatius, and this woman came to the end of the Mass, and she said, "Why are you always talking about the Jews?" And I said, "Well, he was a Jew, right?" Well, see, that's not in their horizon. And one fellow told me that he was so impressed growing up in the Midwest, he thinks this is largely an East Coast problem, in the Midwest, that the nun told his class, and he's about my age, so he's not young anymore, but the nun said, if Jesus was here and there was a synagogue across the street and a church, he'd go to the synagogue. And he said, you know, here's a guy telling me 50, 60 years later, he remembers that incident. And that's the sort of verbal communication of understanding of another faith that's respectful. And, I mean, Catholicism had a lot to go through to get that.
I don't disagree with you.
No,
I
okay.
agree with you about Gavin Langmuir. I do.
You like him?
Well, yes.
Yes.
Yes, imagine. Yes. Such things happen. But I will just mention a critique of Gavin Langmuir, an article that was published by David Engel, a historian at NYU, some years ago, against a definition of anti-Semitism. That's the title. So against Gavin Langmuir. And his argument is that when we look at anti-Semitism and try to understand it as we're doing right now, he said it's as if we have file cabinets. And we have a cabinet marked anti-Semitism. And then we look for examples to put into that file cabinet. So we find it wherever we can so that we can fill up that file cabinet. And that's the danger, David Engel says. I just throw that out to warn, let's say, all of us, myself included, not to go too far with any of this and to always keep in mind that there's another side. Yes, it's true, when we talk about blood libels and all the horrible things that happen in Crusades, etc., let's also remember times when Jews and Christians lived happily together. That is also part of our history, and that too needs to be remembered and revived and kept in mind. Positive examples. The Jewish women were the midwives, and Christian women were the wet nurses, and lived in intimate relations with one another, as you would in such roles.
Yes, I totally agree with that.
Let me have a final question before I turn it up to the audience here. In terms of like criticism, let's say, of the state of Israel, however you want to define anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism, anti-Israel sentiment, what is worse, the anti-Semitism of the left or the anti-Semitism of the right?
Well, what is bad? What do we mean by bad? Physical threats to the Jews. If that's the worst, I would say, in this country, if you look at violent incidents, with the conceivable exception of Brooklyn, because there are specific circumstances in various places, I would say, there's more danger from the right. That is, the magazine,
So your short answer would be that the prejudices on the left are more dangerous to Jews than on the right?
Well, I think the locked synagogue doors, they're not being locked against people from pro-Palestinian groups. I mean, that's not, now, it's not to say that it couldn't happen, but since it hasn't happened, I guess I'll say, that's not, the threat is Pittsburgh. The threat comes from the racist right. I think Israelis would say something quite different. They would say, the hostility to Israel throughout the Muslim world, or in parts of the Muslim world, or in the Arab world, would, represent the kind of existential threat, or at least lots of missiles from Hezbollah, that is really of danger to us. And, if there's some crazy right-wing, old-fashioned anti-Semites, that's not our problem. So the context, where we're talking about matters a good deal.
Again, with this discussion, because you brought up Gavin Langmuir, in a sense, we can follow his method and think about it this way. We have a political situation. 90% of congressional districts in the United States have virtually no Jewish inhabitants, no residents. 90% of congressional districts. So what the strategy has been, whether you like it or not, of the Prime Minister of Israel, Bibi Netanyahu, is to form alliances with Christian evangelicals and win their support. There are many, many, many more of them. They fill the congressional districts, and they're quite reliable. So in some sense, he's turned Israeli support in the United States for Israel into less of a Jewish issue, into more of a Christian evangelical issue. So when the U.S. Embassy was dedicated in Jerusalem, he brought over the Hagee and another a Christian evangelical minister to make benedictions. What? There are plenty of rabbis in Israel. Why is he bringing Christian ministers from America to do that? It was outrageous. And he did other things, but okay.
The Jews don't care about the emphasis.
There were plenty of rabbis who would have.
Yeah.
All right. So that political strategy has been to win congressional support for politically. That's the one level. Now, what does that mean sort of on the ground, so to speak? For him to have done that has meant that Israel is identified with the Republican Party. A rabbi said to me not so long ago, we were chatting about something or other, and then he said to me suddenly, oh, you must be a Democrat. Rabbi, maybe he worried I'm not observant enough of the Sabbath or Kippur or something, but a Democrat. So we've changed also Jewish identifying qualities, and that's a very dangerous thing. I just want to say that although one can certainly object to Israeli policies, I do wonder sometimes, having just read Keith Feldman's book, A Shadow Over Palestine, about black civil rights leaders in the 60s, beginning a very sharp critique of Israel. It's a great book, brilliant book, very sophisticated. I wonder, why didn't you care also about the Caribbean, about Puerto Rico, about Cuba, about the Philippines, about Southeast Asia, where there was a horrible war, they were dropping napalm? Why? So, it does raise a question for me. There are other parts of the world where people are being treated horrifically as well. That is in no way to excuse the policies in the government of Israel, and I think they've gone in the wrong direction since '48 with the decision not to let the Palestinian refugees return, whoever, for whatever reason they left. That's set forth a terrible, terrible calamity that I hope will be addressed, and I hope it will happen before I die. But the problem is always demonization. I've been around with women's circles, and women talk together about feminist issues, what's wrong with the patriarchy. And sometimes somebody will start demonizing men, and then I get nervous. It's the turn to the demonization that we have to, the fantasies that Ray here talks about. That's what we have to watch out for.
Yeah, just one thought, in terms of the leftist critique, and I think it's because, I think Israel is held to a double standard. I think one of the reasons is we have a lot more contact with Israel. I haven't gone to China to see what happens in China. I know it cognitively, but I've been to Israel. I've been in a refugee camp. I've seen the Palestinians, the way they're treated. It's not nice. Now, isn't that extraordinarily different from the way African Americans were treated in this country for a long time? No. But when the Catholics I meet who go to Israel now, they all come back with a similar viewpoint. And part of it is an anti-colonial atmosphere, all right, in the wider circles of politics. We have a pope from South America. He knows sort of the colonial experience on at least historical level. I went into a shop in California, Berkeley, a number of years ago, and it was a travel agent. We used to go to travel agents. It wasn't long. I had to go to a travel agent. And there was a poster, a big poster on the wall, and it said, "Visit Israel before it reaches you." And the idea, expansionism, Israeli expansionism. But this was, I presume, a leftist shop, but they felt free to put that up on a poster. So the left, I think Israel finds itself in a very vulnerable target area in terms of the decolonization process. And if you know the early, this is where I see a very unfortunate development, namely the Jewish thinkers who are far advanced in how the situation in Palestine and Israel should have developed. They're obscured by, second-rate politicians who are just after votes. And we take somebody like, President Trump has referred to you Jews, meaning the Israelis. And, it's remarkable that
It's also part of a larger shift. Right down to the Soviet Union, also brought an influx of 1.5 million Russians.
That's right.
Very, very right-wing political views and, particularly racist views. And that has also altered Israel's politics.
Okay. Let me get some questions here. Somebody asked whether Israel's quote-unquote bad behavior and the behavior of people like Harvey Weinstein, the Sacklers, Jared Kushner, Stephen Miller, and so forth, did that contribute to an anti-Jewish or an anti-Semitic? Or is that just epiphenomenal? What do you think?
Well, I guess I would separate the Israel situation from various bad actors, or people who were regarded as bad actors in American society. I mean, I think when various events have happened in which Jews, like Harvey Weinstein, are shown to be monsters.
Who's a bad actor in several senses?
Right. And Bernie Madoff, and very, I mean, the traditional view in the Jewish community is, oh my God, what are they going to think of us? And in fact, it doesn't show up. I mean, there are bad actors of various sorts, maybe even some Catholics, certainly, known to happen.
Who live in a very big glass house.
Just saying.
Yes.
So, I think it has been a source, and now it's old news, but a source of some astonishment that notorious Jewish bad actors don't seem to actually. I mean, the phrase in Yiddish is a disgrace in front of Gentile eyes. That this is a danger that we have to be worried about. The public. But if you think of the recent, the prominence of Jews in the sort of anti-Trump world, from Adam Schiff to Stephen Miller. I mean, they're all over the place, so you can pick your poison, so to say.
I would just say, I was amazed when Monica Lewinsky, remember that with Clinton?
Yeah.
I kept thinking this is going to be another Dreyfus affair, and it wasn't. And she wasn't targeted as a Jew. And that was striking to me. That's different.
Some Arabs did target her, though, because apparently they thought Clinton was more of a friend of their cause than previous presidents, and that they were bringing down Clinton. They staged this Lewinsky affair. I don't know how widespread that was.
Should we distinguish between discrimination and prejudice? Talking about that. Are those two separate entities?
Well, I think discrimination points to an act and prejudice points to an attitude.
Yeah, you can't ban people's attitudes. I mean, if they don't like people who have blonde hair, I mean, what can you say?
You would agree? Okay. Holocaust survivors are dying off, and many millennials have never even heard of Auschwitz and places like that. Is that an issue in terms of contemporary understandings of Jews and the recent 20th century history of what happened to the Jews and the creation of the state of Israel? Is that an issue that should be of concern to the Jewish community, and how to keep that memory alive?
Absolutely. So, first of all, I think that what human beings are capable of doing, what we saw in the Holocaust, is something that every human being should worry about. This is what we're capable of. And that should frighten all of us. I have to say, I'm fortunate that I was born after the war, that I grew up and my father was involved in the civil rights movement, and I had the experience of hearing Martin Luther King speak on many occasions and be deeply moved, especially by the way the Bible came alive in his words. And I felt with him, it was extraordinary what a human being can become. So I think we need to have both in mind. the utter depravity that we're capable of, and at the same time, the transcendence. So, yes, of course, we have to understand that the state of Israel was created because where were these refugees to go? And had there been a state, yeah, my grandmother might have lived. So that is part of, without question, the picture that we have to keep in mind.
Do you think that the Jewish community, at least in the United States, has done a good job of addressing the rise or the spike in violent anti-Semitic acts? In what ways have they been sort of on top of it and responding, and what could they do that hasn't been done to address the rise of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism?
Well, I mean, I don't think there's been a shortage from both the left and the right in denunciations of anti-Semitism. I mean, it is sort of the swear word to accuse people of, Republicans, in certain kinds of ugly ways. But, Republicans denouncing Democrats as being the party that harbors, Representative Tlaib and so on. And on the other side, the Republican Party is the party that or at least the administration that covers for the Charlottesville, anti-Semites and so on. So, I mean, from that standpoint, what is the Jewish community doing? It's, locking the doors of synagogues and being concerned about those things. But I don't think that there's been a particular need for Jews to stand up and say this stuff, more than they have. We have.
My teacher, Ismar Schorsch, published a book called Jewish Reactions to German Anti-Semitism. He looked at the late 19th century, rise of anti-Semitism in Germany, and Jews tried everything. They went to law courts and accused people of defamation when they published horrible anti-Semitic pamphlets. They published books about Judaism to try to educate people. They got Christians involved also. Nothing worked. So I don't know what works. And yes, you can have a guard, as there is a guard who stands in front of my synagogue, but so what? So someone will come with a gun and shoot the guard. Is there safety? What worries me are simply Jews on the streets, walking down the street in Brooklyn, suddenly being attacked, being hit on the head, or having their clothes pulled, or their, that's, what does one do?
Well, when we've had these anti-Semitic actions recently, I mean, you have a whole crowd of bishops and religious leaders denouncing them. Again, I don't think it has much of an effect. The people who perpetrate these crimes don't read statements from bishops. And one of the things I've been struck by...
Catholics don't read statements.
Yeah. But one of the things I've been struck by in recent years is when I show my class on the Holocaust various films that involve anti-Semitism and reports on anti-Semitism, they're always astonished that there could be such terrible anti-Semitism in just the last century. They don't think of it. Now, maybe these recent incidents have made us more aware of it, but I was always a little surprised that they didn't find more anti-Semitism in their day-to-day lives, but they don't.
There's a couple questions here having to do with college campuses. So let me try to put this together here. One is, of course, President Trump's policy of invoking Title IX issues and somehow tying anti-Semitism or anti-Israeli statements to Title IX issues of prejudice and so forth. Has that helped or hurt? And on the other hand, there's the Department of Justice investigation of the supposed anti-Semitism of New York University and the failure of their NYU administration to answer those charges. We want to talk about anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism on college campuses and the way it's been embedded or not in the past year or so.
Well, the Title IX issue is quite technical and not very relevant. I mean,
Okay.
I do think, and what I hear from, for example, our Hillel director, is that Jewish students, hear from them in questions here, feel in a way that that hasn't been the case when they've grown up, challenged or put in a box as, you know, colonialist or whatever, in a way that makes them feel assaulted and unsafe.
Do you think, are you aware of any students at Trinity College Hartford that feel?
I haven't had conversations with them myself, but I do gather that that's the case. And, you know, I think one of the problems with Israel is that on the one hand, I mean, from within the Jewish community, I guess. On the one hand, there's a great deal of encouragement and, you know, to identify with Israel, to go on birthright trips, you know, lamentations that the younger generation doesn't feel as identified with Israel as we would like them to be, and so on. And then on the other hand, charges of dual loyalty, which the ADL actually construes as greater loyalty to Israel than to America, are, you know, reacted to with a degree of distress and even hysteria that somehow anybody should think of that. Now, there is a certain tension between those two positions. And you know, I don't think it's a tension that can not be lived with. We live with it. But, you know, if it's strictly speaking dual loyalty, I mean, many people in this country have dual citizenship. You know, France and America, the United States. I presume that you're entitled, if you have dual citizenship, to be loyal to both countries. That's dual loyalty. Is that, you know, so, you know, we don't have, but, you know, I think that there is unhappiness on campuses mostly from this end, not from the conservative side.
You know, when I hear about, I have a very pious family, Hasidic family, and pious family who do not believe there should be a state until God sends the Messiah. So they're not state-oriented or Israel. So I want to also just perhaps put another element here. And nonetheless, they're attacked on the streets, walking down the street and so on. Or they hear nasty words spoken to them and some called out. So it's not always about Israel. In terms of college campuses, I don't have a problem with Dartmouth. With my students, with any student, but Jewish Studies is one of the most popular departments on campus. Half the undergraduates take a Jewish Studies class. I don't know why, but that's great and fine. But I do have trouble with some colleagues. And what I find disturbing is colleagues who engage in what is called cancel culture. You know that phrase, cancel culture, where they just wipe you out, your existence. You won't speak to you, won't say hello, you don't exist, you're not included, you're out of the conversation. You are canceled.
At BC, we have this thing called the BC look away.
So I have that with colleagues, both right-wing, Jewish colleagues even, and left-wing colleagues. And that I find disturbing. So it comes from both ends, and I find it more with faculty than I find with students. Faculty who are very, very passionate about their ideological beliefs to the point where they won't talk. I don't think they even know what I think or feel, but there's no conversation possible. That disturbs me greatly. And I think, what are they going to do in their classroom with their students?
Yes.
Jim, do you want to address this?
Well, at BC, it surfaces usually in the spring when the group that supports Palestine rights has a demonstration on campus. And they put up a wall, an imitation of the wall in Jerusalem. The barrier. And they have slogans on that. And I know some of the Jewish students have protested that, and they have their own sort of counter demonstration. But it's a handful of students. I tried, as part of the censure, to set up a seminar. We did it for graduate students to discuss the Palestinian-Israeli issue. And I tried to do it for the undergrads, and it didn't work because they were too passionate. They were not into conversation with one another. The people interested in such a seminar had already made up their minds totally, and they didn't want to hear the other side. So I disbanded it after a few sessions, difficult sessions.
I think there's a question addressed to me, because I'm the one who made the remark, about I mentioned that 10 or 15 years ago it was politically incorrect to even make anti-Semitic remarks. And that and maybe implicitly regretting the decrease or the disappearance of political correctness that somebody said, but isn't political correctness in a sense the enemy of the kind of free debate that universities are committed to? And isn't political correctness shut down honest discussions about how people feel? I didn't.
So answer the question.
Okay. I regret the disappearance of political correctness in the sense that I really loathe at hominem remarks. So when political correctness said, you can no longer use the N-word, that was a good day. When political correctness said you can no longer make Jewish jokes in public, that was a good day. My answer would be, you're entitled to your prejudice. That doesn't give you the right to make insulting remarks in public. That's right. So to that extent, I guess I'm for political correctness, although anyone who's taken a class with me knows that I'm among the least politically correct people,
Really?
Yeah, I know. Yeah, but I mean, so I think there was a reticence that was not a bad thing. That there was a moment when we say, well, wait a minute, I better not pull that trigger because that's a remark that's going to
I
be
would
really
say
offensive.
instead of political correctness, I just say people should speak with dignity and respect for others, with refinement, and that the classroom is not a local diner where you can sit and chat with your friends. It's not a pub. It's a special place, and you speak in a particular way, and what you say should be informed and should be articulate and thoughtful. You present what you have to say and should be substantive because you don't want to waste people's time. And I think a university then is this extraordinary place of
I know. We
classrooms.
had a conversation. Susannah and I were both on the board of visitors for Harvard a couple years ago. And you had an incident, we talked about this incident during one of the meetings, that you felt that a student asked you a question in class during a seminar that was deeply insulting. The student was not aware of it. It wasn't consciously anti-Semitic, but they asked the kind of question. And you said, part of my duty as a professor is to stop there and say, you didn't know it, I'm not blaming, this is not a moral thing. But in fact, I found that to be a deeply insulting question. I mean, would you stand by that?
I don't even remember this. We'll have to
Okay.
fill me in later.
Okay.
What was the remark? Can't say.
I don't remember.
You said that you thought it was a teaching moment, and you should just say to the student, no, you can't say that. But that is an insulting question. And
I don't know, insulting, I would say that there must be something academically useful when you speak in class. And simply to throw out, as you say, an ad hominem remark, that's not useful. So there's a certain kind of discourse that's appropriate to a classroom and to a university that's special. It's very special. And we mustn't lose that.
Jim, this is a question to you. When you made the Giuliani remark.
I didn't believe that.
No. The question is, somebody says, a couple months ago, Giuliani declared on TV that he was more of a Jew than George Soros. Is that related to what we're talking about tonight? I mean, is that itself a kind
Well,
of...
it's so zany. I mean, what does he mean by? I mean, I can't pursue their meaning thread. I don't think there is much of a meaning thread when Giuliani speaks.
Well, let me help you.
Oh. Mark is going to recover that.
I think it's of a piece with his bosses, of the guy he represents, Donald Trump, comment about loyalty. That if you're Jewish and you vote Democratic, you're being disloyal. And the question then arises, well, disloyal exactly to whom? And if you sort of work through the references and stuff, what he meant was disloyal to Israel. And I think that's and the Jewish community went sort of nuts, because once you sort of accuse Jews of disloyalty, like you're into dual loyalty territory, no, we can't go there. But I think that's Giuliani's comment, that George Soros is somehow, by being a lefty, by being, supporting causes that are, in some sense, can be construed as anti-Israel. Therefore, he, Giuliani, along with Trump and so on, by being vigorously pro-Israel, are actually more Jewish, which is a degree of projection, which is, pretty shocking.
But it's an example of the demonization. There's someone, a George Soros, Holocaust survivor, is demonized all over the world for what? Okay.
I'm fine. That was not a response to you. Somebody wrote that, something you said, Susannah, the Jews want normalization in society. And this person writes, this reminds me of the experience of Jews in late 19th century enlightened Europe, which helped to spur the rise of Zionism. Are we in a period of reverse enlightenment now? And Jews need to be more assertive about equality in secular society.
That question has
Wow.
your name written all over it.
Who asked that? Who asked? I like that question so much. I want to know who you are. You're too shy to say it. Maybe.
This is not public confession, so you don't
Eric, we have
have
to
to do it.
talk. Yeah.
They'll find you afterwards.
Yeah, it's a terribly complicated situation, of course, and we try to figure out the strands. Which strand is it? Is it liberalism? Is it socialism? Or what strand can give us a better society? A better
So do you
world?
think that the basic
Yeah.
question here is that should, let's say, Jewish Americans be more assertive about equality in secular society than they are? Or is the desire for normalization actually lending itself to a kind of anti-Semitic?
That was the dilemma for a long time, the question of normalization and assimilation, because that's what arose by the 1870s in Germany, in Europe. The Jews were too assimilated. One didn't know who was a Jew, and so they became a kind of demonic, invisible force. And that's what led very directly to Nazi propaganda and so on. What should Jews be doing now? That's the big question. What should one do? And is it something that Jews need to do? Or is it something that non-Jews need to do to change? It's a big question, isn't it? And what is our responsibility to one another? And I have to say, when synagogues are attacked in this country, we're shocked. We're shocked because we don't expect it, because it's un-American. This is not America.
But you were saying in the
Unavoidable.
Shabbat after that, there were lots of Gentiles.
Of course, people came out, people really reacted. That never happened before in Jewish history. People got all this support. But on the other hand, let's also remember that this is a country where black churches have been burned to the ground all over the place, where thousands of black men, mostly, and women and children also, were tortured and lynched, with photographs taken and distributed. So maybe we as Jews also have to pause for a moment. I mean, we came to this country and thought, paradise, freedom. But maybe we also have to see that there is another element to this country, and what this country, this America, means in terms of slavery, in terms of Native Americans, appropriation of land and killings. Let's think about that too. That's also the land that we've come to. It's not just the land of liberal democracy.
The
You want to
land
talk
of
about
no
the
Irish
Mark, you were
need
the
apply.
Enlightenment kind of guy. You want to talk about the Enlightenment?
I think it's always perilous when you're, if you get up in front of an African-American audience and start talking about you people, that's not good. And I think, Catholics will feel the same way, and Jews feel, some Jews will do this and some Jews will do that. The Jewish vote these days is divided between, the Orthodox Jews vote quite Republican, and everybody, and it's only 10 or so % of the population, the Jewish population. The rest of Jews vote Democratic over, very substantial numbers. And I think that, the instinct of the Jewish community has been, it's good to have people on all sides. And I think that's a good instinct. We now know that the Catholic vote exactly mirrors the national vote. And, the question is, or I think the challenge is these days, that increasingly all our positions on issues begin to mirror our politics. And whereas in the past, certainly, the Roman Catholic positions have bridged, been in different political places. And I think that the belief that in civil society, religious organizations will not all map directly into our politics has been a good thing. And that concerns me a lot, that that's disappearing.
I just want to add one point, and it's astonished me over in recent years, certainly. I teach a course, or I taught a course on German Jewry, which was a very pleasurable course to teach because there's such genius in that culture. But one of the things that I regret is that the diaspora achievements of Jews has been eclipsed far too much by talk about the Holocaust and talk about Israel. I mean, now Alan Wolf has a book on the diaspora, and any of us who have had experience with Jews in the diaspora appreciate their extraordinary achievements. And the idea that that was eclipsed. Now, when I was growing up, there was this talk, I don't know how serious it was in the Jewish community, but it hit, I had a friend down in the apartment below me who was Jewish. And somehow he felt under pressure he would have to move back to Israel because all Jews should go to Israel to build it up. Now this was in the 50s. And I think that mentality has eclipsed this extraordinary achievement. I mean, the Jews have so much to be proud of in what they've accomplished and what they've done in this society. I remember, final thought, the first time I went to the Leo Baeck Institute in New York, it used to be in a brownstone. I went up to meet with the assistant director about some research, and I was climbing the stairs. I mean, they had photos of all the German Jews who had won the Nobel Prize. So by the time they got to the guy's office, you were totally intimidated. You would think, I don't belong in this circle. But it's an achievement that should be celebrated.
I think we're out of time, but please join me in thanking our panelists here.